Thinking about tomorrow? You're 69, Mary. You won't be around much longer. Lauren's voice cut through the air like a rope snapping in a storm. She stood across from me in the narrow pine-paneled office, hand resting on my desk as if it were hers. The smell of salt water drifted in from the harbor, carried by a wind cold enough to sting the skin along my cheek. My fingers tightened around the worn leather ledger. The paper inside smelled faintly of dust and diesel. 40 years of tides and contracts. I didn't answer her right away. I watched her eyes. There was no malice in the surface, only a sharp, calculating impatience. Behind her, Daniel shifted his weight, the wood floor creaking under his boots. He wouldn't look at me. "You've worked hard?" Lauren added, softer, as if a change in tone could sweeten the cut. "But the future, it belongs to those who can carry it." I thought of the man who once stood in this same spot, my husband, John, placing the first signed charter into my hands. "Keep your hands on the wheel, Mary, even in the worst squall," he'd told me. I could still feel the heat of that day, the resin scent of fresh, cut pine, the sun burning bright against the bay. But this wasn't 1983. This was a damp October afternoon, and the harbor outside looked bruised under a slate, gray sky. Gulls wheeled above the pier, their cries threading through the open window. Somewhere below, a line slapped against a piling. Sharp, rhythmic, unbothered by our little human storm. Daniel cleared his throat. "Lauren's just thinking about what's best for the company," he murmured. Still, his voice lacked weight, as if even he didn't believe it. I caught the flicker of something in his eyes. Guilt, maybe, or the memory of how many nights I'd sat up in this office balancing the books while he was a boy asleep upstairs. "What's best?" I repeated, my voice even as a matter of perspective. Lauren smiled, thin and fixed. "We need to modernize the contracts. The clients, they want fresh leadership. You've done your part. Done my part." The words landed heavier than I expected. My part had been mornings in sleet hauling invoices to the dock, afternoons in this chair while John was at sea, evenings cooking for a family that ate and left without thanks. My part had been keeping this company alive through storms, debt, and years when the harbor froze solid. The office felt smaller now. The tick of the wall clock was suddenly loud, matching the pulse at my temple. I set the ledger down, letting my hand rest on its cracked spine. Beneath my palm lay more than numbers. It held the story of every ship, every cargo, every deal that had passed through Ellison Marine. Lauren leaned forward. "You don't have to decide today. Just think about it. For the future? The future." As if mine had already been spent, I looked at her polished nails on the edge of my desk, and for a moment imagined them clawing through the pages of this ledger, stripping it bare. A strange calm settled over me. I could almost hear John's voice, low and steady. "The wheel is still yours." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window frame. The scent of coffee from Harbor Street drifted in, mingling with the salt. Daniel shifted again, and this time his eyes met mine. There was a question there, maybe a warning. But he didn't speak it. "I'll think about it," I said, sliding the ledger toward the center of the desk. Lauren straightened, satisfied. "Good. That's all we're asking." But she didn't know. She didn't know that the pier, the accounts, and the charter itself were still in my name. She didn't know about the brass key in my coat pocket, the one that opened the safe beneath this floor. And she certainly didn't know that I was already counting the steps to the day she'd learned the truth. She turned to go, Daniel trailing behind. He hesitated by the door. For a second, I saw my boy in him again, not the man who stood beside her now. Then he stepped out into the hall. The sea was still moving, and so was I. They left, thinking I'd surrendered, but the tide hadn't turned yet. The office felt emptier after they left, though the scent of salt and pine still clung to the air. I sat for a moment, listening to the low hum of the radiator, letting the tide of memory pull me backward. It was 1983 when John and I first stood on the pier with nothing but a second-hand boat and a contract written on paper so thin the ink blotted through. The harbor was different then, rougher, fewer polished yachts, more working trawlers with hulls scared by years at sea. The gulls were just as loud, though, and the wind still cut in from the bay with that same icy bite. We rented a narrow office above the bait shop. The floor smelled of fish and diesel, the windows rattled in every storm. John would be gone for days, piloting runs up the coast, while I kept the books and answered the phone that rang maybe twice a day. When the radiator failed in January, I worked in my coat and gloves, a cup of coffee cooling faster than I could drink it. People in town didn't expect us to last the year. But we did. We learned the schedules of every tide, the quirks of each captain we hired, the way to stretch a gallon of fuel when the orders were lean. I typed invoices on a machine so loud it made the counter jars in the bait shop tremble. At night, John and I would walk the dock, checking lines by flashlight, our breath hanging in the frozen air. The charter was signed that spring. Both our names in blue ink, side by side. We kept it in a manila envelope, slipped into the bottom drawer of a desk we'd rescued from the town dump. "This," John had said, tapping the paper with a calloused finger, "is the wheel. Don't let go of it." Through storms and lean seasons, I didn't. Even when John was lost to the heart attack that struck without warning, I came back to this harbor the next morning. The air smelled of rain and rope. The gulls cried over an empty pier. I signed contracts alone, sent ships out with cargo, and paid every man on time. Now, 4 decades later, I could still see the ink on that charter, still feel the weight of the pen in my hand. It wasn't just a document. It was the promise that the company's course would be set by someone who understood what it had cost to keep her afloat. Outside my window now, a freighter's horn sounded low and long. I thought of Lauren's polished nails, her smooth voice talking about the future, and my grip on the wheel tightened again. Unseen but unbroken. By late afternoon, the harbor's light began to shift. The water took on that deep copper tone it only wears in October, the sun dropping low behind the ridge. I stayed by the window, letting the glow pull more memories to the surface. There was a winter in the early 90s when the bay froze nearly solid. The fleet sat idle, ice clinging to every rope and cleat. We had no runs booked, no income coming in. I remember standing with John on the pier, our boots crunching over the frost, wondering if we'd see another spring. He grinned at me through his scarf, frost sparkling in his beard, and said, "Mary, ships and people both survive by moving. We'll find a way." We did. We hauled smaller loads for the canneries inland, bartered dock space for supplies, kept the books clean enough to weather the worst. Each season taught us that survival wasn't luck. It was stubborn work and the refusal to hand the wheel to anyone who hadn't earned it. I thought of the faces that had passed through this company. Captains who'd trusted us with their livelihoods, crews who'd shared coffee and laughter in this very office, even customers who sent Christmas cards years after a single job. Every mark in the ledger was tied to someone's story, and every story was tied to mine. That ledger still sat on my desk, its leather warm under my palm. The safe beneath the floor held more than the charter. It held proof of decades' worth of decisions, some easy, most not. Those pages were my shield, though Lauren didn't know it. She saw a tired woman nearing 70. She didn't see the storms I'd outlasted, or the way tides could turn overnight. A knock at the door broke the stillness. It was Captain Hughes, his cap in his hands. "Evening. Mary thought you might want the weekly dock report." His voice carried the salt and gravel of the harbor itself. I took the folder, catching the scent of rope and engine oil that seemed to follow him everywhere. "Thank you, Hugh," I said. Our eyes met for a moment, and I wondered if he'd overheard anything earlier. He gave a slight nod, as if to say he was still in my corner, then left without another word. I set the report aside. Outside, the freighter's horn sounded again, a reminder that ships were still coming and going, tides still rising and falling. The company had weathered worse than an ambitious daughter-in-law. The light faded completely, leaving only the hum of the radiator and the faint glimmer of the desk lamp on the ledger's cover. I closed it gently, my fingers lingering on the spine. The past had built these walls, these docks, this life, and the past had taught me one lesson above all: you don't surrender the wheel just because someone else wants to steer. The next morning, the harbor was wrapped in fog so thick it blurred the masts into pale ghosts. I arrived at the office early, the smell of damp rope and diesel clinging to my coat. The floorboards creaked under my boots as I crossed to the desk, setting down the ledger and a steaming mug of coffee. By 9 o'clock, Lauren swept in, her heels clicking sharp against the old wood. Daniel followed a step behind, shoulders hunched against the chill. They were here for the quarterly operations meeting, one we'd always held in this office with its pine walls and window view of the pier. The staff gathered: Captain Hughes, 2 dispatch clerks, and a dockhand named Mike who still wore his knit cap indoors. The radiator hissed, pushing back the cold in uneven bursts. Lauren took the head of the table without asking. "Let's get started," she said, sliding a glossy presentation folder onto the table. Her perfume cut through the room's mix of salt and coffee, sweet but edged with something sharp. She talked numbers, projections, new contracts she claimed were ours to bring in. I listened, noting the errors in her assumptions. Routes that clashed with tied schedules, expenses glossed over. Daniel said little, his eyes fixed on the papers in front of him. Then it came. She turned toward me, her voice carrying across the table. Mary, with all respect, some of the older methods are holding us back. We can't run this like it's still 1990. The room went quiet except for the radiator's hiss. I set my coffee down, watching the ripples settle in the dark liquid. Captain Hughes cleared his throat. The old methods keep us in the black, Lauren. She smiled without warmth. And they keep us small. I'm talking about scaling, branding, modernizing. I'm sure Mary did her best for decades, but times change. The words landed like cold spray. My hands rested flat on the table, the wood cool beneath my palms. Inside, I felt the same steadiness I'd held in storms, the kind that comes when you know exactly where the wheel is and who should be holding it. Daniel glanced up, met my eyes for a moment, then looked away. The clerks shifted uncomfortably. Mike studied his boots. I'll consider your ideas, I said evenly. But a business like this doesn't live in a brochure. It lives on tides, fuel prices, and trust built over years. Lauren's lips curved in something close to a smirk. Trust is important. So is knowing when to step aside. The radiator hissed again, loud in the silence that followed. Outside, the foghorn from a trawler moaned low, a sound older than any of us in the room. I leaned back slightly, letting the moment stretch, every eye watching to see if I'd flinch. I didn't. Lauren moved on with her presentation as if nothing had been said, flipping through pages of projections and marketing jargon. Her voice filled the room, but the edges of it seemed to fade under the steady beat of my pulse. I kept my hands folded on the table, listening. Every so often, she'd glance at me, a flicker of challenge in her eyes, as if daring me to push back. I didn't. Not here. Not with Daniel sitting rigid beside her, his knuckles pale against the folder in front of him. When she finally stopped talking, the room was too quiet. Captain Hughes shifted in his chair, the old wood creaking. We've been here before, he said, his voice graveled but calm. People come in with ideas. Some stick. Most sink when the weather turns. Lauren's smile tightened. The difference is, I know how to steer us into the modern market. I'm not afraid to take the helm. My gaze didn't waver. A helm without a chart is just a wheel spinning in the dark. Her eyes narrowed slightly, but she said nothing. The silence stretched again, thick with the smell of coffee gone cold and the faint tang of salt drifting in through the window. Daniel cleared his throat. We could blend the approaches. Keep what works, try new things carefully. He looked at me then, not with defiance, but with something that reminded me of the boy who once begged to ride along on a delivery, bundled in an oversized coat, grinning at the spray. Lauren closed her folder. We'll discuss it again next quarter. The meeting ended in an awkward shuffle of chairs. The clerks left quickly, whispering to each other. Mike tugged his knit cap lower and slipped out without a word. Captain Hughes lingered just long enough to meet my eyes and nod once, then followed the others. Daniel was the last to move. He hesitated at the door, one hand on the frame. For a heartbeat, I thought he might speak. Instead, he gave a small, uncertain nod and stepped into the hall. Lauren stayed a moment longer, her gaze sweeping the office as if assessing it for renovation. Mary, she said, almost sweetly, don't take it personally. It's just business. I waited until she was gone before I let my shoulders ease. The fog outside had thinned, revealing the outlines of the pier and the masts bobbing gently. Somewhere out there, a line slapped against a hull, steady as a heartbeat. I crossed to the desk, opened the ledger, and let my fingers rest on the familiar ink. The pages smelled faintly of pine and oil, decades of work pressed into every line. Her words still hung in the air, but they didn't unsettle me. In this harbor, storms passed, ships returned, and the wheel for now was still mine. 2 days after the meeting, the wind came in hard from the northeast, pushing whitecaps across the harbor. The windows rattled in their frames, and the smell of salt was sharp enough to taste. I was sorting invoices at the desk when I heard the brisk rhythm of Lauren's heels in the hall. She stepped in without knocking, a manila folder tucked under one arm. Daniel trailed behind, his hands shoved deep in his coat pockets. His gaze was fixed somewhere over my shoulder, as if the far wall had suddenly become fascinating. Mary, Lauren began, closing the door, I've brought something for you to sign. Just a temporary authorization. Standard procedure so we can streamline operations. I gestured toward the chair opposite my desk. Let's see it. Thus she sat, sliding the folder across the scarred pine surface. The paper inside was crisp, smelling faintly of toner and something chemical beneath. The top page bore the company letterhead, but the language was dense. Transfer of signing authority, consolidation of accounts. Streamline? I asked, keeping my voice even. This moves the operating accounts under your control. Her smile was practiced. Only for efficiency. You've earned a break from the day. Today headaches? Daniel shifted his weight, the floor groaning under him. I caught the quick glance he sent toward the window, the pier beyond blurred by spray. I picked up my pen, turning it slowly between my fingers. The metal was cool against my skin. If it's temporary, there's no harm in waiting a few weeks. Lauren leaned forward, the scent of her perfume cutting through the room's mix of coffee and salt. Timing is critical. We have contracts pending. Delays cost money. The radiator hissed, its warmth uneven. I let the pause stretch, hearing the distant clang of a halyard against a mast outside. I'll need to review this, I said, sliding the folder back toward her. Her expression cooled a degree. I understand you're cautious, but hesitation can look like weakness to our partners. Daniel's jaw tightened. He didn't speak, but I noticed his hand curl slightly in his pocket, knuckles pressing against the fabric. I set the pen down. I've weathered worse storms than a contract negotiation, Lauren. For a moment, neither of us moved. The wind thudded against the siding, rattling the old glass panes. Somewhere in the harbor, a gull cried high, sharp, insistent. Lauren finally stood, taking the folder. We'll revisit this soon. I'd hate for us to miss the opportunity. She walked out, Daniel following. But just before he stepped through the door, he looked back at me. There was something in his eyes. A flash of the boy who once trusted me to steer him home through fog. When they were gone, I sat back, the paper's faint chemical scent still lingering in the air. My gaze drifted to the safe under the floorboards, where the original charter rested. I thought about the balance sheets I'd checked the night before, the small inconsistencies I'd spotted. A storm was building, and it wasn't out at sea. That evening, long after the harbor lights had come on, I stayed in the office. The fog had rolled back in, wrapping the pier in a damp hush. Only the distant hum of a diesel engine broke the quiet. I pulled the ledger closer, its leather warm from the desk lamp, and opened to the most recent pages. Numbers have a language. These spoke of something out of rhythm. Fuel expenses padded, vendor payments routed through unfamiliar accounts. At first glance, it could be clerical error, but the pattern repeated, always leading to the same secondary account number, not one I'd authorized. I unlocked the bottom drawer and reached for the bank statements I'd kept separate. The paper was cool against my fingers, the faint smell of ink and file dust rising as I unfolded them. My eyes tracked the columns, withdrawals in neat, rounded figures, each just small enough to slip past casual notice. They dated back 3 months. Lauren's arrival to modernize had been in month 4. The radiator gave a tired sigh, and I pushed my chair back, crossing to the safe beneath the floorboards. The brass key felt solid in my palm. A turn, a click, and the heavy door swung open. Inside, alongside the original charter, lay a folder of archived financials, records that still carried the faint tang of the oilskin envelopes we'd once used at sea. I set the old sheets beside the current statements. The contrast was plain tighter margins then, every dollar accounted for, sloppy bleed now like a hull taking on water. My pen hovered over a figure, circling it in red ink. A payment to a consultancy I'd never heard of, one with an address in Boston. No invoice, no justification. Outside, a gull called once, its cry thin against the mist. I thought of Lauren's smooth assurances, the way she'd pushed that folder toward me this morning. Efficiency. Opportunity. Words meant to soften the press of her hand against the company's throat. I closed the safe, locking it with a decisive turn. The metal's cold echoed in my fingertips as I returned the key to my coat pocket. The office smelled of cooling coffee and old pine, a scent that grounded me as much as the weight of the charter itself. When I finally stepped outside, the boards of the pier were slick under my boots. Harbor Street was quiet, save for the low murmur from the cafe's back room. The tide was on the turn, water slapping gently at the pilings. I stood for a moment, breathing in the salt and damp rope, and let the sound steady me. This wasn't just about numbers on a page. It was about trust, about a wheel I'd promised never to let go. And if Lauren thought I'd hand it over without a fight, she hadn't learned a thing from the tides. By the next week, The chill had settled deep into the harbor air, seeping through my coat as I crossed the pier toward the office. The gulls seemed quieter, their calls muted by the heavy gray sky. Inside, the office was warm enough, but the air felt different, thinner somehow, like something vital had been siphoned out. Lauren had rearranged the schedule board without telling me. The morning doc briefings I'd run for years had been moved to her. Strategy meetings? In the upstairs conference room. My name was absent from the printed agenda posted by the stairwell. It wasn't an oversight. Daniel passed me in the hall carrying a stack of folders. "Morning," he said, without slowing. His voice was polite, distant. The same tone you'd use with a stranger on the street. The scent of fresh ink trailed from the papers he held, sharp against the background smell of coffee drifting from the break room. I went to my desk. The ledger still sat where I'd left it, but the phone was quiet. No calls from clients, no questions from the doc. The radiator clanked once, a hollow sound in the stillness. By mid-morning, I decided to walk down to the pier. The boards were slick with salt spray, and the wind pushed at my back. At the far end, Captain Hughes stood checking a line on one of the smaller freighters. He looked up, the brim of his cap shading his eyes. "Mary?" he said, voice steady over the slap of water against the hull. "Haven't seen you at the morning meets. They're being held upstairs now," I replied. My breath made small clouds in the cold air. No one sent me an invite. His jaw tightened. Figures. The talk's mostly contracts and branding. Not much about the tide tables or dock repairs. We stood in silence for a moment, watching a gull swoop low over the water. The smell of diesel drifted from the freighter's engine, mixing with the clean bite of salt. "Don't let them edge you out?" Hughes said finally. "You built this place?" I nodded, though the words settled heavy. Easier said than done. He gave the line a final tug, then glanced at me. "If you need anything, you know where to find me." Walking back, the sounds of the harbor felt distant, muffled. I passed the cafe on Harbor Street, its windows fogged from the warmth inside. The smell of fresh bread curled out into the cold, momentarily softening the edges of the day. I thought about stepping in, but the weight of the ledger in my bag reminded me there was work to do, even if no one expected me to do it anymore. Back in the office, the upstairs meeting was breaking. Lauder spilled down the stairwell, unfamiliar voices mixing with Lauren's sharper tone. My desk phone stayed silent. When the voices upstairs finally faded, the office returned to its new silence. I busied myself with maintenance logs, the ones no one had asked me to review. The ink on the forms was still fresh, the smell mingling with the faint tang of salt drifting in through the cracked window. Just before noon, Lauren appeared in the doorway. "We've got lunch with potential investors," she said. "No need for you to wait around." Her tone was smooth, final. She didn't step inside. I looked up from the logs. "I'll be here." She gave a brief smile, one that didn't reach her eyes, before turning on her heel. The faint echo of her heels on the hallway floor lingered even after she'd gone. The hours crawled. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the low horn of a freighter heading out to sea. The sound rolled through the harbor, steady and deep. I wrapped my hands around a mug of coffee gone lukewarm, the ceramic cool where it should have been warm. By late afternoon, I decided to walk the dock again. The boards groaned under my boots, the air damp with the smell of rope and fish. Down by the mooring posts, Captain Hughes was bent over a crate, checking the seals. He straightened when he saw me. "Thought you might have gone home." "Didn't feel like it," I said. "The office isn't exactly lively," he grunted. "It's quieter than it should be. Folks notice even if they don't say it." We stood side by side, watching the tide creep higher against the pilings. A gull landed nearby, its feet tapping softly on the wet wood. The freighter's wake sent a gentle roll through the water, lapping against the hulls with a sound like slow applause. Hughes pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket. "Dock report. Figured you'd want the real numbers, not the polished ones going upstairs." I took it, the paper cold and slightly damp from his hand. "Thanks, Hugh," he nodded. "Whatever's coming, you've still got friends down here?" The words caught me off guard. It had been days since anyone in this company had said something without calculation behind it. I tucked the report into my coat, feeling its weight alongside the brass key to the safe. Walking back toward the office, the last light of day broke through the clouds, spilling a streak of gold across the water. For a moment, the harbor looked the way it used to, alive, honest, unadorned. I let the image settle into me, a reminder that not everything had been taken. Inside, the office was exactly as I'd left it, ledger on the desk, radiator ticking. The air faintly scented with old pine and cooling coffee. The upstairs lights were off. Whatever deals had been made at lunch, I wasn't part of them. I opened Hughes's report, and began to read. The numbers were tight, clean, nothing like the inflated figures I'd been shown in recent weeks. It wasn't just a report. It was proof that some currents still ran true beneath the surface. And for the first time in days, I felt the faint pull of a tide I recognized. The morning of the contract signing dawned bright but cold, the kind of October light that cut sharp across the water. The harbor bustled with movement, crews shouting over the hum of idling engines, gulls circling in wide arcs, the scent of diesel and salt thick in the air. Lauren had chosen to hold the ceremony on the Maine pier, a stage set against the backdrop of moored freighters and stacked cargo crates. A long table draped in navy cloth stood at the center, flanked by rows of folding chairs. A banner with the company's name fluttered stiffly in the wind, its corners snapping against the ropes. I arrived quietly, the brass key in my coat pocket pressing against my side. Captain Hughes was already there, checking the mooring lines. He gave me a brief nod before disappearing toward the dock hands. Daniel stood near the table, adjusting his tie, his face tight. Lauren spotted me and smiled, but it was the kind of smile that announced a move in a game. "Mary?" she said, voice carrying over the chatter. "Glad you could make it. We're showcasing the future of Ellison Marine today?" I took a seat near the back, next to a stack of coiled rope that smelled faintly of tar. The chairs in front filled quickly, local officials, potential clients, even a reporter from the Camden Chronicle. The wind lifted strands of hair across my face, bringing with it the briny chill of the bay. When the speeches began, Lauren took center stage. She spoke about modernization, expansion, partnerships. Each phrase was polished, the kind that fit neatly into a press release. She thanked Daniel for his vision, and the team for their adaptability. Then she paused, letting the wind carry a beat of silence. "And," she continued, "I'd like to acknowledge the contributions of our past leadership. Traditions are important, but so is knowing when to step aside for progress." Eyes turned toward me. I felt the gaze of the crowd like a shift in the tide, subtle but undeniable. Lauren's smile widened, her hand gesturing in my direction. "Mary Ellison has been a steward of this company for decades. We appreciate her service." Service. The word tasted metallic around me. A few polite claps rose, thin and uncertain. Captain Hughes stood near the edge of the pier, his jaw set. Lauren moved on without missing a beat, unveiling the new contract with a flourish. She held it high for the crowd to see, the paper snapping in the breeze. "This marks the next chapter," she declared, one led by a new generation. A murmur rippled through the gathering. I caught Daniel glancing my way, then quickly looking down at the table. The reporter scribbled something into his notebook, his pen scratching faintly under the gusts. I stayed seated, hands folded in my lap, the cold from the metal chair seeping through my coat. The smell of coffee from a vendor cart drifted over, warm and bitter, an anchor in the moment. My eyes followed the banner's restless flap, the letters of the company name twisting briefly out of shape before snapping back. Lauren signed the document with a practiced flourish, the black ink stark against the white page. Flashbulbs popped from a photographer crouched near the front. The contract lay open, the wind tugging gently at its corners. And all the while, the wheel in my mind stayed steady, untouched by her performance. When the applause faded, Lauren invited the officials to the table for photographs. She moved with the confidence of someone who believed the day belonged to her. Daniel stood beside her, smiling for the cameras, though his eyes kept flicking toward the edge of the pier where I sat. I stayed still, letting the cold wind press against my cheeks. The smell of the bay was stronger now. Brine and oil mingled with the faint sweetness of kelp drying along the pilings. My fingers traced the edge of the ledger in my bag, its familiar weight grounding me. "Mary," Lauren called suddenly, her voice bright enough to cut through the chatter. "Come join us for a photo, a historic moment." Every face turned. The reporter's pen froze above his notepad. I rose slowly, my boots thudding against the wooden planks as I walked forward. The table loomed under the banner. The new contract spread like a flag across its surface. Lauren stepped aside just enough for me to stand in view. "We want the community to see the continuity," she said, the words shaped like a kindness but landing like a stone. The photographer lifted his camera. "Closer together, please." I obliged, moving in, the scent of Lauren's perfume brushing my senses. The shutter clicked several times. When it was done, she leaned toward me just enough for only I to hear. "Legacy looks better when it's framed, doesn't it?" I didn't answer. The gulls cried overhead, their wings flashing white against the steel, blue sky. The wind tugged at the banner again, snapping it into place. As the crowd began to disperse, I stepped back, watching Lauren shake hands and exchange business cards. Daniel lingered a few paces behind her. For a moment, his gaze caught mine, something unspoken in it, but too quickly shuttered. Captain Hughes appeared at my side. "You handled that with more grace than I would have managed," he muttered, his eyes on the churning water. "I've weathered worse," I said quietly. We walked together toward the end of the pier. The boards trembled slightly underfoot with the movement of the tide. A freighter's horn echoed from the channel, low and steady. I could taste the salt on my lips. "You're not out yet," Hughes said. "Don't let this morning tell you otherwise." I nodded, eyes on the horizon where the sunlight broke through in fractured beams. The contract might have been signed for show, but the real keys to the harbor were still in my pocket. As we reached the pier's end, the air was quieter, the bustle behind us muted by distance. The smell of tarred rope hung in the stillness, familiar and unchanging. I drew a slow breath, letting the rhythm of the water steady my thoughts. They could frame me in their pictures, wrap me in polite applause, and speak of stepping aside. But the tide didn't answer to a photographer's flash, and neither did I. Sometimes storms pass slowly. Sometimes they're waiting just beyond the horizon. Folks, if you were standing on this pier, hearing your legacy reduced to a caption, would you fight for it or let it drift away? The morning after the pier ceremony, the harbor was wrapped in a damp stillness. A thin mist clung to the masts, softening the edges of the boats. From my office window, I could see gulls perched silently on the railings, their feathers ruffled against the chill. I unlocked the door to the small storage room at the back of the office. The air inside was cool and faintly musty, smelling of paper, rope fibers, and the oilskin envelopes we'd used decades ago to keep contracts dry at sea. This was where I kept the archives, ledgers, invoices, and, most importantly, copies of every bank statement since the company's first account was opened. The metal filing cabinet groaned when I pulled the top drawer open. My fingers brushed over worn manila folders, the edges softened with time. I pulled the ones marked for the last 6 months and carried them to the desk. The chair creaked under my weight as I sat, spreading the folders open. At first, the numbers were polite, neatly typed, columns straight, balances positive. But I knew the rhythm of these figures like a captain knows the pull of a current. And here, the current was off. Payments to unfamiliar vendors. Transfers to a secondary account not tied to payroll or operations. Each one small enough to avoid alarm on its own, but together they told a different story. A floorboard outside the office squeaked. I looked up. Daniel stood in the doorway, hands deep in his coat pockets, the scent of cold air following him in. "Didn't see you at the morning meeting," he said. "Wasn't invited?" I replied, keeping my tone even. His eyes flicked to the papers spread across my desk. "What are you looking at?" "History," I said. "The kind you can't rewrite." He hesitated, then nodded once before stepping back into the hall. His footsteps faded toward the stairs. I returned to the statements, marking each suspicious entry with a red pen. The ink smelled faintly metallic, sharp in the warm air from the radiator. One name kept appearing: Harborfront Consulting. I'd never heard of them, but they were billing the company thousands every few weeks. A quick scan of the invoices, thin, perfunctory, no detail, made my pulse quicken. Reaching under the desk, I lifted the rug in the corner and unlocked the safe set into the floor. The brass key turned with a click, the sound oddly loud in the quiet room. Inside lay the original charter, its paper thick and faintly scented with the pine drawer it had lived in for years, alongside a smaller folder marked legal. I placed the suspicious statements inside, tucking them between the charter and the legal folder. Then I locked the safe, returning the key to my coat pocket. The radiator hissed. Outside, a gull gave a single sharp cry. I looked out at the harbor, the tide slowly rising against the pilings. The water moved in deliberate rhythm, pulling in and out with a patience born of centuries. If Lauren thought she'd moved me to the sidelines for good, she'd forgotten one thing. Even from the edge of the deck, I could still chart the course. That night, the office felt like another world, dark except for the warm cone of light spilling from my desk lamp. Outside, the harbor was a shadowed mirror, the outlines of boats swaying gently in the tide. The air through the cracked window carried the faint scent of brine and wood smoke from a chimney on Harbor Street. I slid the phone toward me and dialed the number listed on Harborfront Consulting's invoices. The line rang twice, then clicked to a voicemail greeting. No company name, just a flat, mechanical voice. Leave your message after the tone. I hung up, the silence after the beep pressing against my ears. Leaning back, I pulled the company registry from the bottom drawer. The pages were cool under my fingers, their edges rough from years of handling. I traced down the H section until I found it. Harborfront Consulting LC. The listed address was a post office box in Boston. No physical office, no names attached. The radiator popped as it cooled, the sound startling in the quiet. I began cross-referencing the payment dates with the bank statements. Each transfer matched a gap in our supply invoices, like someone had slipped the money out through a crack only they knew was there. In 3 months, the total had passed $60,000. The chair gave a slow creak as I shifted forward, the ledger now open beside the registry. My pen scratched a tight circle around the first payment, the ink pooling slightly on the paper. The metallic tang of the ink filled the small bubble of lamplight where I worked. A shadow crossed the frosted glass of the office door. I froze. The handle turned slightly, then stopped. After a beat, the shadow moved away, footsteps fading down the hall. I waited until the quiet settled again before pulling a fresh folder from the cabinet. I labeled it in red, unverified vendors. The letters looked stark against the cream tab. Into it, I placed the photocopies of each suspicious invoice, the registry listing, and my notes. The folder's weight was slight now, but it would grow heavier with every new piece I found. On impulse, I checked the lock on the safe, then slid the brass key deeper into my coat pocket. The metal was cold against my palm, grounding me. My eyes drifted to the charter lying inside, steady and certain, like a keel beneath shifting water. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight. Outside, the tide had turned, pulling water back toward the channel. The sound of it, steady, insistent, echoed faintly through the walls. I knew then that this wasn't just carelessness or bad bookkeeping. Someone was siphoning from the company on purpose, hiding it in plain sight under Lauren's modernization. And if the money trail led to her, the contract on the pier was just the surface of a deeper betrayal. Closing the ledger, I switched off the lamp. The office fell into shadow, save for the silver path of moonlight across the desk. My coat felt heavier as I slipped it on, the key pressing against my side, the new folder tucked securely under my arm. Out on the pier, the night air was colder, the boards damp beneath my boots. The smell of salt and creosote rose from the pilings, sharp and real. I paused at the edge, listening to the water. The tide was moving again, and so was I. Sleep had been a stranger for days. I lay in bed listening to the harbor breathe. Waves lapping against the pilings, the occasional clang of a loose halyard tapping against a mast. The room smelled faintly of salt and the cedar from the chest at the foot of the bed, where my husband's sea jacket still hung, its oilskin softened with age. The clock on the dresser glowed 20:17 a.m. I rose, pulling on my robe, and padded to the kitchen. The floorboards were cool under my feet, the air holding the faint scent of last night's coffee. I poured water into the kettle, the metal clink echoing in the quiet. While the kettle hummed to a boil, I took the old photo album from the shelf. The leather cover was worn smooth, corners bent from years of opening. I flipped to a page near the middle. There we were, 30 years younger, standing on the deck of our first freighter. His arm around my shoulder, the horizon stretching behind us, a promise in every line of his face. "Keep your hands on the wheel, Mary," he'd said that day. "Doesn't matter how rough the water gets." The kettle whistled softly, and I poured the hot water over a tea bag. Steam rose, carrying the scent of chamomile. I cupped the mug in both hands, letting the heat seep into my skin. The moonlight through the window silvered the table, the steam swirling in its glow. My mind kept circling back to the Harborfront folder, now locked in the safe beneath my office floor. Every figure I'd circled, every vendor name I didn't recognize, lined up like buoys marking a dangerous channel. The 60,000 gone was only what I'd found in plain sight. There could be more hidden deeper. I sat at the table, sipping slowly, the tea cooling as the night stretched on. The radiator in the corner ticked once, then fell silent. The only sound was the soft pull of the tide outside. By dawn, I knew I couldn't wait for the truth to surface on its own. Lauren and whoever she was working with were counting on my silence, on my absence from the upstairs meetings. They wanted me to drift quietly into the background, I rinsed the mug, the porcelain warm against my fingers, and set it in the sink. The horizon was beginning to pale, the first smear of light breaking over the water. I stood there a moment, breathing in the mix of salt and morning chill, and felt the old steadiness return. They'd moved me off the deck, but I still had the charts, the compass, and the will to steer. By the time the sun broke fully over the harbor, I was dressed and walking down Harbor Street. The air was crisp, carrying the mingled scents of baking bread from the cafe and diesel from a trawler warming its engines. My boots clicked on the damp pavement, each step measured. The bank opened at 8. I waited across the street, watching the tellers ready their stations through the glass. When the door unlocked, I crossed over and stepped inside, the warm, dry air wrapping around me. The faint aroma of paper and printer toner mixed with the sharper tang of fresh coffee. At the counter, I asked for Evelyn, the branch manager. We'd known each other for years. She'd handled the company's accounts since my husband and I first signed the charter. She ushered me into her office, a small space lined with filing cabinets and smelling faintly of lemon polish. "What can I do for you, Mary?" she asked, settling into her chair. "I need copies of all withdrawals and transfers tied to account ending in 9423, I said. 3 months back at least. Her brow furrowed. "That's the secondary business account. Lauren's been using it for?" "I know," I said, keeping my tone steady. "I just want to see them in print." She nodded, turning to her computer. The quiet click of keys filled the room. Within minutes, she slid a stack of papers across the desk. The weight of them felt heavier than it should have. I scanned the list. Harborfront Consulting, same amounts, same pattern. But there were others now, smaller names. One linked to a luxury marina in Boston, another to a boutique law firm. Evelyn leaned forward. "Mary, if this is about—" "It's about knowing where the ship is leaking," I said. I slid the papers into my folder. And how to plug it. Back at the office, I went straight to the storage room. The smell of rope and old ink met me like an old crewmate. I spread the new bank printouts beside the invoices I'd collected. The lines connected cleanly now, like a chart of hidden jewels. I began writing a timeline, marking each suspicious payment, each matching invoice, each vendor with no clear service rendered. The pen moved steadily, the scratch of it on paper like the ticking of a clock. My tea from the night before still lingered in my senses. Chamomile, faint and calming though my thoughts were anything but. Near midday, I heard footsteps in the hall. I closed the folder and slid it under the ledger. Daniel's head appeared in the doorway. "Lunch?" he asked, as if nothing in the world had shifted. "Not today," I said. His gaze flicked to the desk, then away, and he left without pressing. When the hall was quiet again, I took the folder and locked it in the safe. The brass key felt warm from my grip. I tucked it back into my coat pocket, patting it once, a silent confirmation. Outside, the tide was rolling in, the water striking the pilings in soft, steady bursts. The gulls had returned, their calls sharp against the wind. I watched them for a moment before turning back to my desk. The plan wasn't finished. But the chart was starting to take shape, and I intended to follow it every mile until the harbor was mine again. By the next week, the harbor had settled into its autumn rhythm. Fewer tourist boats, more freighters heavy with cargo. The air carried the faint bite of oncoming winter, mixed with the smell of wet rope and diesel. I walked the length of the pier each morning, not for show, but to listen. The first step of my plan was to reclaim the flow of information. I began visiting the dockmasters before sunrise, long before Lauren arrived. In the cool pre-dawn light, with the gulls still quiet, they were more willing to talk. I learned which contracts were behind schedule, which suppliers were unhappy, and which crew members had started looking for work elsewhere. Every note went into a small leather bound book I kept in my coat pocket, the pages smelling faintly of salt from my hands. Back at the office, I rearranged my own desk, pulling it closer to the window that overlooked the pier. I wanted a clear line of sight to the comings and goings. Lauren might have the upstairs conference room, but I had the waterfront. I also began calling old contacts, captains, shipping agents, repair crews, using the pay phone in the cafe on Harbor Street instead of the office line. The cafe's air was warm with the scent of baking bread and coffee, the chatter of locals masking my voice. Some contacts were surprised to hear from me, others not at all. All of them still respected my word. "Keep this between us for now," I'd say. "You'll understand soon." By midweek, I'd stopped signing off on automatic payments to non-essential vendors. Evelyn at the bank handled the changes quietly, No alert sent to the upstairs office. Each time I initialed a form, the pen scratch felt like the turn of a wheel steering the company back on course. One afternoon, I intercepted a courier on the dock. The wind whipped at the papers in his hand, carrying the faint scent of printer ink. The envelope was addressed to Harborfront Consulting. I smiled, took it, and told him I'd make sure it reached the right hands. It never did. Instead, it joined the growing stack in my safe. Daniel crossed my path more often now, his eyes narrowing slightly when he saw me talking with crew or captains. Once, he stopped. "Lauren says you're inserting yourself again." "I never left," I said. He shifted his weight, glanced at the water, then back at me. "She won't like it." "She doesn't have to." The wind picked up, carrying the clang of a halyard against a mast. He didn't reply, only walked away, his hands deep in his pockets. By Friday, my leather book was half full. The pages held names, dates, amounts, and small notes in shorthand only I could decipher. The weight of it in my pocket was a comfort, like a compass pointing true north. That evening, I stood at the edge of the pier, watching the last freighter of the day ease into the harbor. Its running lights glowed faintly in the dusk, the hull slicing the dark water with slow certainty. The smell of the sea wrapped around me, steadying my breath. The current was shifting. I could feel it. Saturday morning brought a heavy fog that swallowed the harbor whole. The air smelled of wet canvas and seaweed, every sound muffled. The thud of boots on the pier, the distant groan of a winch, the drip of water from the eaves. It was the kind of weather that hid movement, and I intended to use it. I left the house early, my leather book in one pocket, the brass key in the other. The safe in my office opened with a muted click. I laid out everything I'd gathered: the harborfront invoices, the bank printouts, the courier's intercepted envelope, and the names of trusted allies. The desk was a map now, every paper an island, every note a buoy marking the route ahead. Step 2 of the plan was to quietly pull resources out from under Lauren without her realizing. Evelyn at the bank processed my instructions to freeze certain discretionary funds. Coded in a way that looked like routine. Budget realignment. The smell of the bank's lemon polish clung to my coat as I left. The paperwork tucked deep inside. I also began reaching out to the union representative for the dockworkers. We met in the back corner of the bait shop, where the air was thick with salt and fish oil. He listened as I outlined the inconsistencies in pay and conditions that had started since Lauren's modernization. His expression darkened, and he promised to keep me informed. By mid-afternoon, the fog began to lift, revealing the outlines of moored ships like ghosts fading back into the world. I walked the pier, stopping to speak with a captain I'd known for 20 years. His voice was low, the smell of tobacco on his coat. "If you're taking the helm back, Mary, you won't be alone." Back at the office, I filed my notes, locking the most sensitive ones in the safe. The rest I kept in the leather book, its worn cover warm from my hand. Outside, Lauren's voice carried faintly from the upstairs balcony, light, laughing, speaking to someone on her phone. I stood in the shadow of the staircase, unseen, listening long enough to hear her mention, finalizing the Boston deal. That confirmed what I suspected: the harborfront trail led straight to her. By sunset, the harbor was alive again, the water reflecting streaks of orange and gold. I stayed until the last of the light drained away, the air cooling, the scent of the tide deepening. Every step back toward my house felt measured, the book heavy in my pocket, the key pressing steady against my side. The plan was no longer just an idea. It was a living thing, coiled and ready, and soon it would move. If you were me, holding the proof, the power, and the patience, would you strike now or wait for the perfect tide? Monday arrived with a hard wind off the bay, snapping the flags along the pier and rattling the windows in their frames. The air smelled sharp, salt, diesel, and the faint metallic tang that always came before a storm. I tightened my coat and walked toward the office, the brass key warm in my pocket. The board meeting was scheduled for 10. Lauren had called it to finalize strategic partnerships, but I knew it was about locking in the harborfront deal before anyone could question it. I arrived early, unlocking my office and pulling the harborfront folder from the safe. The papers lay in neat order: invoices, bank statements, the courier's intercepted envelope, and my handwritten timeline. The scent of old paper and lemon polish from the bank clung faintly to them. At 9:45, I crossed the hall to the conference room. The space smelled faintly of fresh coffee and the varnish on the long oak table. Large windows overlooked the harbor, where whitecaps danced under the wind. Lauren was already there, speaking in a low, confident voice to two board members. Daniel sat opposite her, tapping a pen against his notepad. "Mary," Lauren said smoothly as I entered. "Glad you could join us." I took a seat near the center, laying my leather book and a slim folder on the table. The board members shuffled their papers, the sound crisp in the quiet. Lauren began her presentation. Slides of projected growth, photos of sleek container ships, a map showing new routes. Her voice was polished, her perfume faint but pointed, like citrus with an edge. She spoke of Harborfront as if it were the crown jewel in a new era. When she paused for effect, I opened my folder and slid a set of papers across to the closest board member. "You might want to see the other side of this partnership," I said. The rustle of paper drew every eye. One board member frowned, scanning the bank statements. Another leaned forward, reading the invoices. The air in the room seemed to still, the only sound the faint creak of the windows in their frames. Lauren's smile tightened. "Mary, I don't think these payments," I said evenly, "come from our secondary account. No documented services rendered. The receiving address is a post office box in Boston." Daniel's pen stopped tapping. His gaze dropped to the papers, and a flicker of something, recognition maybe, crossed his face. I reached into my leather book and withdrew the courier's intercepted envelope. This was on its way to Harborfront last week. I intercepted it because, frankly, I wanted to know where our money was going. The envelope lay on the table between us, the weight of it far heavier than the paper inside. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the glass hard enough to make the coffee cups tremble. Lauren's voice was cooler now. "You're making unfounded accusations." "No," I said, meeting her eyes. "I'm presenting documented transactions." The silence that followed was the kind that only comes before something breaks. The boardroom air had changed, thicker, sharper, as if the storm outside had slipped in through the cracks. One of the senior members, Mr. Keating, cleared his throat. "Lauren, why is a consulting firm with no physical office receiving tens of thousands from our accounts?" Lauren's fingers tightened around her pen. "They provide specialized market analysis, confidential contracts, hence the minimal paperwork." "Minimal?" I said softly. "Is one word for it. Non-existent is another." The scent of fresh coffee seemed stronger now, almost bitter. Ms. Grant, who had managed shipping logistics for 20 years, pushed her glasses higher on her nose. "I don't see any reports from Harborfront in our archives. If they're advising on routes, there should be something." Lauren's gaze flicked to Daniel. His jaw was tight, but he kept silent. Keating turned to me. "Mary, you're saying these payments are unauthorized." "I'm saying they're undocumented. And that's not how this company was built." My hand rested on the original charter, still tucked in my leather book. Its thick paper felt steady under my palm, like a keel in rough seas. Lauren leaned forward, her voice losing its practiced warmth. "With respect, Mary, the industry has changed. We can't operate like it's still the 1980s. We can't survive," I said. "If we treat the harbor like a personal cash drawer." A low murmur rippled among the board members. Outside, the wind drove rain against the glass, streaking it with silver lines. The harbor beyond was a blur of motion and white spray. Miss Grant flipped through the statements again. "These dates several coincide with delays at the Boston dock. I recall Lauren insisting we avoid that port. That's because—" Lauren began, but Keating raised a hand. "Let her finish." Grant's eyes moved to me. "Mary, what's your conclusion?" "That Harborfront is a shell," I said, "and that the money isn't buying analysis. It's disappearing." For the first time, Daniel spoke. His voice was low, but it carried. "Mary, are you certain?" I met his eyes. "I don't bring storms into this room unless I've checked the charts." Something flickered across his face. Doubt, perhaps, or the memory of calmer waters. He looked away quickly. The room fell into a tense stillness. Papers lay open like spilled cards on the table, every figure visible, every line underlined in red. The smell of the varnished oak table seemed sharper now, mixed with the faint ozone of the approaching storm. Lauren's voice was tight. "We can schedule a review." "No," Keating interrupted. "We address this now." The sound of the rain intensified, drumming against the windows as if urging the confrontation forward. I sat back slightly, feeling the tide in the room shift. The questions were no longer mine to ask. The storm outside roared against the windows now, the wind whistling through the narrow gaps in the frame. In the boardroom, the noise was matched only by the rustle of papers and the sharp scrape of chairs as the members shifted toward Lauren. "Explain these," Keating said. tapping the harborfront invoices with one blunt finger. His wedding band clicked against the paper. Lauren's voice wavered for the first time. It's complicated. Certain transactions needed to be off the record while we negotiated. Off the record? Ms. Grant repeated, her tone clipped. For $60,000. Daniel rubbed the bridge of his nose, the faint smell of his aftershave drifting across the table. Cedar? With a trace of citrus. Lauren. His voice trailed off. I reached into my leather book and slid out the final piece. The original charter, signed in my husband's steady hand and mine, dated more than 40 years ago. This document states that no funds may be disbursed without the co-signature of the majority owner, I said. That's me. The room went still. Even the rain seemed to pause as if listening. Lauren's eyes widened. That's not. It's binding, I said. And it makes every one of these transfers unauthorized. Keating turned to the others. We'll need a motion to suspend Lauren's financial authority pending a full audit. I second that, Grant said immediately. Daniel looked at me then. Not with the cold distance of the past months, but with something heavier. Regret? He opened his mouth, closed it again, then finally said, I didn't know not all of it. For a heartbeat, I saw my son in him again, the boy who once helped coil ropes on deck beside his father. But the moment passed as quickly as the tide changes. Lauren's pen rolled from her hand and clattered against the table. No one moved to pick it up. The vote was swift. Authority revoked. Audit approved. The decision sealed with the steady scratching of signatures on paper. I gathered my documents, the faint scent of old ink rising as I closed the folder. The storm was still raging when I stepped to the window, but the harbor lights burned steady through the rain, reflecting off the churning water. This was not the end, it was the turn of the tide. I looked back at the table, at the faces still processing what had just happened. I'll be in touch with the auditors by tomorrow morning, I said. And until this is resolved, no funds move without my signature. No one argued. As I stepped out into the hall, the wind caught the door and slammed it shut behind me. The sound echoed down the corridor, final and certain. If you held the proof, the authority, and the will to act, would you have let them stay or sent them out into the storm? The morning after the meeting was unusually still. No wind rattled the windows, no gulls cried overhead. The harbor, often restless, lay flat and gray beneath a low ceiling of cloud. From my office window, the water looked like pewter, holding the reflection of every moored boat in perfect detail. I arrived earlier than usual, the smell of the night's rain still fresh in the air. The pier boards were slick under my boots, each step leaving a dark print. Upstairs, the conference room door was shut. I could hear faint voices inside, low tense, but I didn't stop. I'd spent enough hours in that room. In my office, the safe opened with its usual muted click. I took out the harborfront folder, now thicker with the board's signed resolutions, and set it in the center of my desk. The scent of old paper rose faintly, mixing with the sharper tang of lemon polish left by the cleaning crew. Around 9, Daniel appeared in the doorway. He didn't step inside right away. His coat was damp at the shoulders, and his hair looked as if he'd run a hand through it more than once. Lauren won't be coming in today? He said. I nodded. That's probably for the best. He lingered a moment longer. I should have asked more questions. His voice was quieter than I'd heard it in months. I looked up from the desk. You had your reasons. Just make sure they don't blind you next time. He gave a short nod, eyes dropping to the folder before he turned away. The faint scent of cedar from his aftershave lingered in the air after he left. By mid-morning, word of the board's decision had filtered down to the dock. The dockmaster stopped by with a stack of updated manifests, his boots leaving faint marks of salt on the office floor. Heard you're back at the helm, he said with a half-smile. Something like that, I replied, flipping through the papers. The ink was fresh, the edges of the paper still warm from the printer. The rest of the morning passed in a steady rhythm. Phone calls to the auditors, updates to the bank, quiet conversations with trusted captains. Outside, the tide began to turn, the water shifting almost imperceptibly toward the open bay. Shortly before noon, I stepped out to the pier. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of diesel and wet rope. From here, the harbor looked alive again, lines creaking, hulls nudging against the pilings, the muffled thump of cargo being moved below deck. I stood there for a long minute, letting the sound and smell of it settle in me. The storm had passed, but the water was still deep, and I had more navigating to do. By the afternoon, the clouds had begun to break apart, thin streaks of pale blue showing through. Sunlight spilled over the water in long, shimmering bands. I sat at my desk with the window open, letting the fresh air carry in the scent of salt and tar from the pier. The auditors had confirmed their arrival for Thursday. I'd already prepared the access lists, careful to limit them to the people I trusted. Each list was neatly typed, clipped together, and stacked on the corner of my desk. The paper edges were crisp under my fingers, the ink still dark and clean. Around 2, a knock sounded at the door. Emily, the youngest in the bookkeeping department, stepped inside holding a mug of coffee. "Thought you could use this," she said, setting it beside me. The steam curled upward, carrying the rich, bitter smell across the desk. "Thank you," I said, watching her hesitate. "Something on your mind?" As she glanced toward the hallway before speaking. "It's quieter upstairs. Feels different." Her voice carried a mix of relief and uncertainty. "Change can feel like that," I said. "But the work doesn't stop." She smiled faintly, then left, the soft click of the door fading into the hum of the radiator. By late afternoon, I decided to take a walk down to the outer breakwater. The stones were slick from the rain, and the wind was cooler here, laced with the metallic tang of the sea. From this vantage, the harbor looked contained, safe, a cradle for the vessels moored within. Beyond the breakwater, the open bay stretched toward the horizon, its surface flecked with light. I thought of my husband then, of the first time we'd stood here together, watching our newly painted freighter ease into port. His voice came back to me, steady and sure. "Always know where your ship is headed, Mary, and always keep a hand on the wheel." The return walk was slower, my boots clicking against the worn boards of the pier. I passed the bait shop, the scent of fish oil strong in the warm pockets of afternoon air, and the cafe where the smell of baking bread drifted through the open door. Back at the office, I found Daniel waiting by the window. He turned as I entered. "I've been thinking about what you said this morning." "And?" I asked, setting my coat on the rack. "I don't want to be part of whatever that was anymore. If you'll have me, I'd like to work things the way Dad did." I studied him for a moment, the light from the window cutting across his face. Actions will speak louder than this conversation. He nodded. "Understood." When he left, I locked the day's paperwork in the safe. The brass key was warm in my palm, the weight familiar. Outside, the sun was low, the water reflecting its gold and copper tones. The harbor felt settled now, each vessel rocking gently in its berth. The tide had shifted for good, and for the first time in months, I felt the current carrying me toward open water, not away from it. 2 months later, winter had settled over Camden. The harbor was quieter now, the water a deep slate blue beneath a pale sky. Mornings began with the smell of wood smoke from chimneys and the muffled crunch of frost underfoot. I had moved my desk from the office to a smaller room overlooking the outer bay. The old oak table bore new scratches from my work, drafting scholarship applications for the maritime fund I'd promised myself I would start. Beside my papers sat a tin of tea, its bergamot scent rising each time I lifted the lid. The fund's first recipients would be local kids, some from fishing families, others who had never set foot on a ship but dreamed of it. I pictured them standing on deck for the first time, the salt air in their faces, the hum of the engines beneath their feet. That thought alone kept my pen moving across the forms. On Thursdays, I still visited the pier. The boards were slick with ice in places, and the air carried the faint metallic tang of snow. The dock workers greeted me with nods or quick smiles, their breath clouding in the cold. Work had steadied, contracts were honest again, and the books balanced cleanly. Daniel kept his distance at first, though we exchanged short updates about shipments or maintenance. One morning, as we stood together watching a freighter ease into berth, he said, "The scholarship, Dad would have liked that?" I didn't answer right away. The gulls wheeled overhead, their cries sharp in the stillness. "It's for the next tide," I said finally. "The one we won't see, but they will." Evenings were my own again. I often sat by the wood stove with a mug of tea, the room warm and smelling faintly of cedar logs. Some nights I wrote letters to old friends in other ports, telling them the harbor was steady again. Other nights, I read from my husband's logbooks, his handwriting carrying the rhythm of waves and seasons. The quiet no longer felt like isolation. It felt like open space. By early spring, the first scholarship checks had been sent. I kept copies of each letter in a folder, handwritten thank yous from students whose futures had just widened like the horizon at dawn. Some enclosed photos: a young woman in a windbreaker on her first training vessel, a boy grinning beside a chart table. Their excitement felt as real as the cold salt spray on a morning crossing. I had begun spending more time at the outer point, where the breakwater met the open bay. The air here was cleaner, sharper, carrying the faint scent of kelp drying on the rocks. I'd bring a thermos of tea, the steam curling into the wind, and watch the tide shift with the patience of someone who no longer feared its pull. One afternoon, Daniel joined me there. The sky was a pale wash of blue, the water calm enough to mirror the clouds. "I've been reading Dad's old maintenance logs," he said, "trying to understand how he ran things." "He ran them like a captain," I said, "not a landlord." Daniel nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. Just the chance to do better." The wind tugged at my scarf, carrying with it the scent of the sea. "The chance is there," I told him. "What you do with it is yours to decide." When he left, I stayed, letting the sound of the water against the rocks fill the silence. Beyond the breakwater, a freighter moved slowly toward open water, its hull slicing the bay in two. Watching it, I felt the same steady certainty I'd known on our first voyage decades ago. That night, I lit a single lamp in the study and opened my husband's last logbook. In the margin of one page in his careful script was a note I had never noticed before. "The harbor is only as strong as those who guard it." I closed the book gently, the leather warm under my palms. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the clock and the faint hum of the wind against the windows. Outside, the tide was turning again, carrying with it the promise of another day. I had kept my hands on the wheel, and I always would. If tomorrow were yours to chart, would you steer back to safe waters or set your course for the open sea?